Well, I do touch on it in the book, and I think it's, again, it goes without saying, when Dr. King and Andrew Young openly said, as they did, that they were looking for Eisenhower judges, I think that's pretty revealing. I don't know that I ever broke down the number of judges or the number of rulings. In fact, I'm sure that I didn't. But I generally looked at some of those judges, who the appointments were, and Brownell, of course. Herbert Brownell, as Attorney General, who was advising him on these nominations. He talks at length in his memoir about very deliberately picking people who would be favorable and progressive on the issue. And of course, Kennedy in the early 60s, and then Johnson, I mean, they're appointing, as you said, Southern Democrats. So it's not surprising to me that that in fact is the case, that the Eisenhower judges were better. It's hard to see how else it could have been given the politics of the South at the time. But again, it's a fascinating piece of the story that no one knows about, and another piece of the Eisenhower legacy that he gets no credit for. I do comment on that in the book. I do point out that Warren grew over time, as I try to give everybody equal credit for changing. It's interesting, though. I mean, the Warren feud is really interesting in a number of ways. If you read the Warren memoirs, you don't have to get very far into it before he starts talking about Eisenhower. And he opens the book, first couple of pages of the book, with this story about running into Eisenhower. Well, it was the plane ride to Churchill's funeral. And Warren, by his own account, confronts Eisenhower. Now, he sets up this story by saying that he and Eisenhower stopped getting along after the Brown ruling because Eisenhower didn't agree with him on Brown. And then his evidence to support that is this plane ride to the Churchill funeral in 1965, when he confronts Eisenhower on the plane and says, "Why are you unhappy with me?" And you know what Eisenhower says? He says, "The communist cases." And Warren says, "Well, what would you have had me done with the communist cases?" And Eisenhower says, "They should have been shot." You know, sort of half joking, half serious. Nothing to do with civil rights at all, by Warren's own account. And so I found very little to support any of Warren's claims about Eisenhower working against the decision, disparaging it. I mean, I just think that Warren really wanted Eisenhower to endorse it publicly. And because he didn't, Warren interpreted that as disagreement. And that's just simply not the case. That I don't know. I do know that I mean, obviously Warren was very instrumental in the '52 convention with the California delegation. Eisenhower was very familiar with Warren, Warren having been on the national ticket before. I mean, Eisenhower was a fan. He really thought Warren was a really big thinker and a great leader, and so they had actually promised Warren during the convention, it was the only promise they made during the whole campaign, that he would get the first judicial spot on the court. And of course, that becomes a whole nother drama, as I talk about in the book, because the first opening is the Chief Justice. And Eisenhower did not think that necessarily that the deal meant Warren got the Chief Justice job. Warren thought it did, and really played hardball with Eisenhower. And I say in the book, that's the beginning of the feud right there, was the fact that Warren played so hard with Eisenhower, and they eventually gave him the Chief Justice job. But no, I'm not aware of the speech. I just think Eisenhower really thought he was very well qualified and very talented, and was really quite enamored with him. I mean, a little bit, but Eisenhower is a very, in many ways, a very apolitical figure. I mean, Eisenhower is a guy who in 1952 was recruited by both parties to run. I mean, he was beloved by everybody. In fact, one of the challenges I had in writing this book is to create a sense for the reader of how huge Eisenhower was. I mean, we don't make Eisenhowers anymore. I mean, this was the most famous man in the world, the man who destroyed Hitler, the man who saved civilization. The only way I could create for the reader a sense of the awe people had of him was telling anecdotes. I used one when Norman Rockwell went to a White House dinner. He went to his doctor and he got a prescription of barbiturates. He was terrified of being in Eisenhower's presence. And so Eisenhower is in many ways almost sort of like Washington, really. George Washington, in some ways, is a good comparison. I mean, he's almost above all of that. What he worried about was the social condition. What he worried about was the reaction of a hostile majority population in the South to a sort of vulnerable minority population. And he worried about, as I said, inflaming passions. He very frequently used phrases like, we could have another civil war, we could have an insurrection. I mean, he used phrases like that all the time. And he really wanted to try to find a way to avoid that. And let me give you just one example, and this is in the book. When he's desegregating the military, one of the things that he did, actually Robert Anderson did it, his Navy Secretary. Robert Anderson, under direct orders from the President to desegregate Navy bases, many of which were in the South, went in without any announcement at all and would just start taking down the white and colored signs on the bathrooms and the public accommodations on the base. And it worked. That people didn't really even notice they were gone, and in a few weeks there was no problem anymore. And Anderson, in many ways, was the embodiment of what Eisenhower was hoping to do, to find ways that fix the problem, but don't rub it in people's faces at the same time. That's what Eisenhower was trying to avoid. Now, I'm, as I said, somewhat critical of him on that, because I think there is a moral component to the presidency, and he could have said more publicly. Again, going back to what a giant figure he was, people would have listened, I think, if Eisenhower, in very moral terms, had said more than he did. But he felt that there were limits to what he could do as far as proselytizing and preaching from the Oval Office, and he wanted to avoid, at all costs, a Little Rock. He got Little Rock anyway, and he acted very decisively. He never hesitated. But that's what his thinking was. That's where he was headed. And we may not all agree with that, but I think it makes sense to understand what he was trying to accomplish, whether or not he could have done more or could have done less. Want to take one more? Well, this is the irony of Eisenhower thinking so little of the role of speeches. He actually was quite good at it. Even as a young military officer, when he was working for General Pershing, Eisenhower was a writer. He wrote, and he wrote for MacArthur, and he was a very concise writer. His writing is very tight. His editor at Doubleday said that when he turned in his memoir of World War II, he didn't change a word. I mean, it was just perfectly done. He was a very good communicator. And I think what's really interesting about the Little Rock speech in particular is in the very first couple of paragraphs, he strikes just the right tone. I mean, the tone of a speech like that really defines everything. I mean, you can have the most lyrical speech in the world, but if it's off key, it's going to rub people the wrong way. Eisenhower says in the first couple of paragraphs of that speech, he talked about being in Rhode Island, where he'd been staying, and he had flown back to the White House to come to the Oval Office to give this speech to the nation, to show both the sadness with which I'm taking this action and the firmness with which I intend to see it carried out. And I think that was just the perfect pitch. He was very sad to have to do this, but he was going to see it done, and it was going to be done right. And I think people respected that. I think people understood that here is the hero of D-Day. He doesn't lie to us. He always tells us the hard truth, and he's decided this is the only option he has. It makes him sad, but he's still going to do it. And I think most people were comfortable with that. Now, I did go back and look at the mail he got in the following weeks, and I mean, some of it is pretty explosive, including a number of very prominent Democratic national leaders who were just outraged at what he had done. I mean, Richard Russell compared it to the stormtroopers, and Jim Wright told him to withdraw troops, and I mean, it was just really, really angry stuff. But Eisenhower was able, I think, with the majority of the people, to strike just the right tone of sadness but firmness. He was a very good writer, he was a very good speaker, and again, this is part of my criticism of it. I think he could have done it more often, and I think he would have been very effective at it. Great. Thank you all very much.